The Friendship Highway by Charlie Carroll. Chig. Lopsang felt his mother's fingers curl around his skinny bicep as she gently shook his arm. He kept his eyes closed. It was customary for her to wake him for school in this way each morning, and customary for him to pretend he was still asleep. The rules of the game stated that his mother would shake him 4 times, repeat his name twice, and then walk away from his bed to shout, "Father, our Lopsang has died in the night. We had better get a new Lopsang."
And as we just rest for a few
This
moments,
was the child's
either
cue
with
to
that
fling back his
nourishing
yak hair blanket,
tone,
leap to his feet and announce,
or if
"I
you're still
told you."
sighing,
Then his mother would kiss him. The game
or
would be
just
over
coming
and
back
a new
to
day would begin.
a silent breath.
Once he jumped from his bed and said, "I told you. But get the new Lopsang so he can go to school for me." His mother did not kiss him
Taking
that
a
morning, and he
hand or
understood
2
that he was
hands to
breaking
your
the
body
game's
if
rules.
that feels good,
From then
maybe
on,
to
he
your
stuck
heart,
to them religiously.
just below your belly button.
This time, it was his
Somewhere
mother
around
who was
there.
breaking the rules. She had shaken his arm a full 8 times and repeated his name at least 5. Then she said something unexpected. "Lopsang, you must open your eyes, Lopsang." This he
See if
did,
you can
if only to
ask
reprimand her over his
the
disrespect
depths
was
of
at their
yourself,
morning ritual,
your heart, your
but the
soul,
words stuck in his
however you'd like
throat,
to word it.
and he felt cold outside his
What you
blanket.
most need from
It
yourself
was
just
still
now.
early March. He knew that, but this was not a morning temperature. This cold meant something was wrong. Instead of reapproaching his mother, he asked a simple, "Why?"
Maybe it's the reassurance to
Later,
know that you're
his
worthy.
mother said, stroking his forehead, "Now you must do what I say, no complaints." "Okay,"
to know
he
that you're
grinned,
loved.
suddenly excited because he knew what his mother was up to. He leapt from the bed and performed a little dance on the floor to make his mother smile. She did not so
Maybe
loud.
it's forgiveness or
She whispered.
compassion.
With pantomime steps,
Maybe
he
it's
tiptoed
laughter.
across the room. "Not so loud," he whispered back, giggling at his impression and at his mother for trying to
Permission to
surprise
feel
him in this
joy.
way. It was all too obvious.
Or permission to feel
He
pain.
grabbed her hand and pulled her ear down towards his mouth. "Are we going on a pilgrimage?" he breathed. Lopsang's mother smiled at her youngest son. "Yes," she said. "We're going
What's
on the
being
best kind of
called for
pilgrimage.
in
We're going
you
to
just
see
now?"
Dorji." Dorji? For all Lopsang's guesswork, he had never supposed a visit to his eldest brother would be the surprise. He adored Dorji, and had thrown tantrum after tantrum when his brother had left over a year ago. When the outbursts had not worked, Lopsang came to understand that he could only bring
And see
Dorji
if
back
you'd
by
like to
being good,
dedicate to the rest
and this would have
of
been
this
really
evening to
good for a
that.
whole year.
Whether
Now
it's
he
come
was
in
going to get
words
his
or a
reward.
feeling or whether you really don't know.
His mother led him
But
out
you're
of their
open
small
to it.
house. A gigantic truck sat on the street with its lights off.
See if you'd like to
But its
dedicate
engine
the rest
running.
of this evening at least.
Following his mother's gestures,
Maybe the
Lopsang
rest of
climbed
the
into the
week.
back of the truck
Maybe the rest of
and
the
picked his way
year
through the crates, boxes and bags to find a corner.
to this
His
quality.
sister Jamyang and his brother Chogyal. Jamyang held out her arms and Lopsang tripped into them. "We're going on a pilgrimage to see Dorji," he said. "I know," Jamyang replied, but she did not smile. Chogyal said nothing and did not look at Lopsang as their mother and father climbed into the truck and sat with them. Their father took a thin but large cotton sheet from one of the crates and pulled it over them all. Lopsang felt
And in a
disappointed
moment,
that his
I'm
father was
gonna
coming
play
on
a
a
game.
pilgrimage.
Just really
He had
simple.
often wished that Dorji was his real father,
Drone.
but he at least seemed to know how to get the truck to start and stop. One bang of his fist on the wall behind him was enough to get the truck rolling. Another brought it
And
to
I
a quick
encourage you
halt.
to drop
"Remember,"
deeply with your
his mother told him
awareness
as they bumped slowly
into the
out and along
ocean
the streets of Lhasa.
that the
"You must
tone
do what I
creates for
say."
you.
Lopsang pressed his hands together in a gesture of
And
prayer,
if you wish to,
bowed his head
I
and
really
grinned.
encourage you, if you
"What
have
must
the
I do,
space to do
Mother?"
it,
He called
to
above the
bring your
roar of the
voice into
engine,
that, whether it's dropping
smiled
into the
back at
tone
him,
with your voice,
reached out one hand and
or
stroked
whether
his
you
forehead.
have something that wants to
It was
sing
now
out,
sleep. He felt aggrieved. Sleep?
if that's
He
something
had
you'd
just
like to
woken up.
explore.
"The more you sleep," his mother remonstrated, "the quicker time will pass, and you'll get to see Dorji sooner than if you stay awake the whole time."
So we're going to play a real
Such
simple
logic had an
tone.
immediate effect, and Lopsang closed his eyes without another word. Though the truck bounced
Just
and
let
its
your voice
interior
be where it wants to
fluctuated
be.
between
I
searing
really
heat and
encourage
numbing
you to
cold,
drop your awareness into the
Lopsang
ocean
slept.
of the sound,
and when he didn't, he pretended
and
he did.
also to drop
Sometimes
your
his
voice
eyes-
into that,
Sometimes his mother or Jamyang nudged him and told him to eat.
so you merge
He'd
into
groan and
the
mutter,
tone
"I'm
with
asleep."
your tone, whether it's the
Very
same,
made sure to
either it's
chew on his
different.
tamper, or on the cubes of cheese he gently nudged between his lips. He opened his eyes to greedily accept any offer of sweets, milk or tea, but made sure they remained shut and his mouth remained mute
And I'm
whenever
sure
a
my
rat
voice will
got
come in and weave
too
around.
He had never liked chat
To
butter,
support you,
tea,
to support your voice
he never would,
and your awareness.
even though years later he would drink at least 5 cups a day, paying its benefits to anyone listening. Lobsang was young and new. He had spent enough time with the erring monks who regularly came to visit his home, some family, most not,
Take your dedication,
to
take that
recognise
quality and
what
pour
the
it into the
truces
ocean,
in their
into your
faces
heart.
denoted, and then recognise that with his own hands what his own smooth complexion suggested. For Lobsang, though he was young himself, adult, his sister and brother, though they were only 15 and 18 respectively, old, Roger, his mother and father, and very old, the monks. And this meant that Lobsang understood time. For the young like him, they had so much of it, they grew easily bored. But for the old like Roger, his mother, father, and the monks, time was something to be continually marked upon and pointed out. Old people, Lobsang knew, obsessed over time because they didn't have much of it left. And so then, 5 days into their pilgrimage, and further back of the truck which was the only excitement left among his family, he understood why. He was prepared to sacrifice as much time as was needed. He had so much of it. To see Georgie again, but his mother and father, February and January, were growing increasingly irritable with each passing hour. One morning, after they had played hide and seek in the clefts of the dusty hillocks for 4 hours, Sugar had hit Lobsang in the face, hiding too well, and left appearing in the rain's pool. Lobsang knew Sugar had broken the rules of the game, and his cheeks stung from the swipe of his brother's knuckles, but he forgave Sugar anyway, because he knew that Sugar's time was running out, and he'd rather not waste it chasing his younger brother through brown caves. Most nights they all slept together in the truck, while it bounced, and Lobsang loved this. But occasionally they stopped in some villages when the stars were brightest to sit in a room with a fire and other old people. When this happened, Lobsang had to lie in the corner of the room with his sister, while she expertly flipped him on the side and pulled his back into his stomach. Lobsang tried to stay awake during those nights because he knew that sleeping in the truck would bring him to Roger quicker. When the hosts went to their own corners to sleep, Lobsang would listen to his mother and father until they talk over the embers of the fire. I want to go back. Don't you understand what would have happened if we'd stayed? Think of your sister and your brother. Their mum agreed with him. She would have come to the protest if she had us left. They already have one brother missing. It would not be fair to have 2. George chose to leave, and he is happy. Let me make my own choices and be happy with that. George's choice was to live and work in the pool, to make money which has helped us live. What was your choice? To be arrested? Men are arrested for crimes and committed no crime. Listen to your father. You would have been arrested. For what? Waving a flag in a battle? That's not a crime, it's a belief. I understand. Lobsang tried to think what something was about, but could not. He just began to cry. Mummy clutched his naked shoulder and told him to come to her. It's all right, Lobsang. Georgia is going to walk home and Martha to find us. And then he's going to take us to the home and school. He had a wife, imagine that, he never sister, and we'll all live together, one family, no one missing. Mountains. When their journey in the truck came to an end, and they stepped to its belly for the final time, all Lobsang could see was mountains. They were white and smooth, never-ending, so tall some had clouds for hair. How could Georgia possibly walk over these? Lobsang tried, but tramping through the deep snow required muscles he had not developed, and the air became too cold and thin for him. So that gendarme, Chogai, his mother and his father, took turns climbing the horses. He did not need to try and sleep any longer. Unconsciousness was too strong, and opponents tried off. He awoke on the bare floor of a tiny monastery. A cup of steaming rat butter tea pressed to his lips. For once, he did not push it away. A monk rolled over him, chanting and spat in his face. Lobsang instinctively shut his eyes tight. When he reopened them, the monk stuck his tongue out at him. He awoke in the back of his father, as they pushed onward through snow. A blizzard around his eyes, his hand audible but not visible. His father patted his right leg and heard the summoned to the storm. He awoke in his mother's lap, her fingers caressing his forehead. Nothing but Trouble's nose discernibly, while the flicker of flame of a single rat butter candle. He awoke to four shakes, and his name called twice. Lobsang, his mother cooed. Lobsang, you are here. She had broken wings again, but he didn't mind this time. Opening his eyes, he looked out upon the green, where there was once white wood, and there was once stone and ice. We're here, his mother said. Georgia is coming. Across the flowered valley before him, in a warm mist devoid of sharp ice and bare rock, Lobsang watched the small figures of two men as they trekked upwards. Is that Dorje? He asked. That, his father said, pointing at the nearest of the two figures, is Dorje, and that, his lone finger was joined by three more and a thumb. As palm outwards, he gestured at the expanse before them all, is Nepal. Lobsang rolled the word, Nepal, his new home, around the contours of his mouth, testing its dimensions against his tongue and lips. He decided he liked it. 6 men appeared from the trees below. They wore uniforms that made it difficult for Lobsang to distinguish them from the ethereal foliage. Hide and seek, Lobsang thought. They'll never beat Dorje, he's a master. The 6 men resolved themselves into a straight line, a border between Lobsang and Dorje. They walked towards the latter, and Dorje's companion emitted an echoing shriek before turning and running in the opposite direction, away from Lobsang. We're over here! Lobsang wanted to call, but found he could not. One of the 6 men raised his right arm. A piercing clap rang through the hills. Dorje's companion fell to the floor. No, Lobsang's father whispered, his voice hoarse and terrified. Dorje had not run. He continued to face the 6 men slowly. He dropped to his knees. The 6 men surrounded him. There was another clap. Lobsang did not see what happened next, for his father had gathered him in his arms. Lobsang's face pressed tight against his father's chest, and was running. Lobsang was crying, and even thought he understood why he was crying for Dorje, and crying for the fact that they were running back towards the snow. Chapter 1. My Snow Leopard. The year Lobsang left Tibet, 1989, was the same year I discovered it. He was 5, I was 9. It was lunchtime, it was wet, and I had found shelter in my school's library. I was no stranger there. and I often liked to sit beneath the shelves of the adult reading section because I thought this made me look clever. That afternoon, I found a copy of Heinrich's Harrer's 7 Years in Tibet, bound in a yellow hardback cover, which faded gold lettering part of a set perhaps. I cannot precisely recall why I was drawn to it. The cover was bare, apart from the title, and I had not heard of Tibet. I think I liked the author's strange name. No matter. What I do remember is opening to the frontispiece, a black and white photograph of a young man wearing a funny hat and holding up a bowl while bald heads and frilly curtains surrounded him, and then flipping through the pages of tiny writing to find a hand-drawn map filled with mountainous peaks and ridges, and through them a long and dotted line of footsteps. Across the map were words, even more unusual than the name of the writer and the faces on the photograph. Lhasa, Shigatse, Gaidnak, Nanda Devi, Dehradun. I took the book home, read it slowly over the next 2 months, and then, to my latter shame, never returned it to the school library. As a child, I was obsessive in my fascinations. At that time, I wanted to be a paleontologist, studying dinosaur fossils, and before that, a marine biologist. Tibet became my new interest, and for the next few years, all I wanted to do was be a Tibetologist. I read whenever my mother could find me, most of it fantastical stories of flying monks and friendly snow lions, but some of it sound and fractal, and I began to pride myself on being a little expert on the country. In secondary school, I never passed the library encyclopedia without flicking to its Tibet section. I used the geography CD-ROMs on my school's computer to stare at photographs and drawings of the plateau. The assessed speeches I had to prepare for English lessons were always about Tibet. I learned that Tibet was not even a country, but the Tibetan Autonomous Region, TAR, within China, yet ethnically Tibetan spread out across a far larger swathe of land known as Greater Tibet, which included not just the TAR, but also the areas of Kham and Amdo to the east, where nomads lived in gigantic tents, rode on horseback and fought with swords. I learned that Tibet's government did not even live in Tibet, but in India, in a small little hill town in that's where we've been. Shh. In a small hill town in Dharamsala, where they pitted their wits against the Chinese and demanded their country back. When it came to China itself, I became confused by the sheer volume of varying ethnicities, and so contented myself instead with the young teenagers' predilection for sound bites. In China, the majority group were called the Han. They had stolen Tibet from the Tibetans in 1950. They had been led by an old man called Mao Tse-tung. I was confused about why the Chinese had done this, why they had invaded Tibet, and moreover, why they were still there. I yearned to find out for myself. At least twice a year, I reread 7 Years in Tibet. Harrow's journey never failed to thrill me. It was the kind of adventure I craved in those days, when I would gawp skyward at the planes which flew miles overhead, or spit from railway bridges onto the roofs of passing trains, giggling to myself that a piece of me was travelling elsewhere. One day I told myself, as I lay on my bed, popped up by my elbows, and reading 7 Years in Tibet for the 12th time, I would go to Tibet. My obsession with Tibet lasted longer than its predecessors had, but it too eventually dissipated, at about the same time as I found music and alcohol. Yet it always lingered. When I left home at the age of 18 to travel for the first time, I hoped it would be to Tibet, but I did not have the means and never made it outside the limits of Europe. Throughout my early 20s, when I attended university and then became a school teacher, I travelled each summer, for this had in its own way become an obsession. For 5 years I spent my Augusts roaming Asia, and though I always meant to, I never made it to Tibet, usually because the country was closed to tourists. And then, of course, I fell in love, and I got married. and for a while I forgot about Tibetan entirely. I was, it seems, not the only one. Perhaps my Tibet fascination coincided with the world's. Throughout the 1990s, the media presence was unstable. The Dalai Lama was a household name. Free Tibet campaigns and organisations popped up everywhere. The Beastie Boys headlined benefit concerts. Protests and riots and marches brought to light the atrocities the Tibetans had suffered at the hands of the Chinese. Even Hollywood got involved. Martin Sorsen made Pandan, his biopic of the Dalai Lama. 7 years in Tibet had been filmed. Richard Gere turned up in Dharamsala to publicly support the Dalai Lama. But as the 20th century came to a close, so did the importance of Tibet's right to self-determination in the public eye. And then in 2008, the Beijing Olympics sparked a wave of pro-Tibet riots and demonstrations that echoed across the globe, returning the Tibet issue to the world's attention, and with it to mine. At the time, I was engrossed in writing my first book, but I used Tibet as a means to take my mind off the copious research on the English education system, which I ploughed through each night. I bought and reread 7 Years in Tibet. I had donated my first copy to a charity shop a long time ago, and then did the same with other books about the country. The old obsession began to creep back in. When I finished my first book, I allowed myself the luxury of 6 months off. I needed to leave England for a while, needed to travel, and there was no doubt that it had to be Tibet. I told a friend about my plans. "You won't be able to get in," he said. "I've been looking into it. The borders were closed after the Olympic riots, but they're supposed to be open now. The trouble is no one really knows. There's just no information coming out of Tibet. The only way is if I go to China and find out for myself." "You won't get in," he repeated. Have you ever read that Peter Matthijssen book, The Snow Leopard? I had in 1973. The writer Peter Matthijssen, joined an expedition into a stretch of the Himalayas which forms the Tibetan-Nepali border. Led by the field biologist George Gala and guided by a scant crew of Sherpas, Matthijssen set forth into the mountains at the beginning of an unforgiving winter. His primary goal was to observe and document the natural routines of a rare species of blue sheep, the Baral, specific only to that locale. Underlying that objective, however, was the potential of an even less hopeful opportunity: the sighting of the snow leopard. The snow leopard might be the most reclusive mammal on Earth, a quiet and secretive creature, with a natural habitat inhospitable to life and to blood. Few Westerners have ever seen a snow leopard in the wild, and Matthijssen hoped to be one of the first. Walking more than 250 miles from Pokhara to Crystal Mountain, over some of the highest passes in the world, Matthijssen spent 2 months on his pilgrimage. After an arduous and frozen journey, living nomadically and aesthetically with few Western comforts, save his journal, he finally returned to America at the end of the year. He had not seen a single snow leopard. "Tibet's going to be your snow leopard," my friend said. "You'll chase it, you'll pursue it, but you'll never see it." If every country is unique, then every border is more so. Some borders reflect their country's desperation for tourism and can be crossed for $10 and a spare passport photo to affix to an entry form. Others make you wait. Have to be sure that you are committed to your entreprise. and so divert you and your patients to an embassy in a 5-day system of visa processing. Still others ask not only where are you going, but where are you from? And the difference between a British and an Indian passport can change your experience dramatically. And then there are the borders, which do not care about your nationality, what your occupation is, how long you wish to stay, your state of health, or even your state of wealth. They remain as impenetrable as a chastity bout, impossible to breach, either from without or within, and those who hold the key guard it jealously. Tibet's many disputed borders seem to flit between all types. At some points in history it has been easy to pass on to its confines, though at most times it has been near impossible, as a wealth of good literature will attest. Vikram Seth surfed lorries over flooding rivers to get into Tibet. The great Heinrich Harrer crossed the Himalayas on foot, and Paul Theroux had to enter the country with the assistance of an altitude-sick Chinese driver who crashed their car on the Tibetan plateau and almost killed both of them. Though the very early 21st century saw some freedom of movement across Tibet's borders, this dissolved during the 2008 Beijing Olympics. Its ensuing pro-Tibetan independence demonstrations. The borders were closed for the best part of a year, opened briefly and then shut again. It is likely they will remain in this unpredictable state of flux for some time, and any traveller who can make it to Lhasa for even a day should count themselves very, very lucky. In Chengdu, one of the closest Chinese cities to the Tibetan Autonomous Region, stories abound of travellers who have crossed the border illegally and then been shot. I soon learned that if I was to get to Tibet, my only chance was through China. I had researched the state of the borders with meticulous determination over the past months to be presented with scant and often conflicting information. I put off my departure time in the hope that something concrete would appear on the 90 online traveller forums I frequented, but it never did, and the weeks began to disappear. I vacillated for what felt an age, but my time was not indefinite, and I had already signed a contract to start teaching again in January. I ruminated on the consequences of travelling all the way to China only to find my entry to Tibet denied, and then weighed that against sitting in my study for the next 4 months in this continued state of uncertainty. With this in mind, I made my decision, and I bought an open return ticket to Chengdu, the capital of Sichuan province, exactly 50 years and 60 months after the 1959 Lhasa uprising against Chinese rule. I boarded a train at Bristol and pushed out through the south of England, finally and eagerly on my journey to the east. My backpack, too large to fit in the overhead rack, rested instead at the end of the carriage. I made sure to sit close to it and to have it in full view, for it contained expensive luxuries I was not used to taking with me on a journey. I had always been a misery traveller. I think that's meant to be noisily. Oh well. I never bought anything new for a trip, but took only what I already owned. Stubs of soap, half-used bottles of 10-year-old sunscreen, and an old pair of trainers and 2 sets of expendable clothes, which could be ripped, burned, or lost without worry. But I stopped up to Tibet. While I waited for news on the state of the borders, in the few moments when I was not working or researching, I shopped. This was going to be a journey unlike any I'd ever taken, and I needed to be prepared for it. The harsh terrain necessitated hiking boots, the harsh weather, waterproofs and thick clothing, the harsh journeys, Imodium. I bought my first ever Swiss Army knife and my first ever iPod. I invested in a hideously lurid but warm ski jacket and a sleeping bag with similar attributes. I put Lemsips in my first aid kit. Aside from my research, my reading and my shopping, a different kind of preparation also filled my time. I set up a new email address to avoid rogue messages popping up on my internet cafe screens and possibly Chinese cyber censor screens. How's Tibet? Getting enough material for your book? I told all my friends and family I would not be calling them while I was away for exactly the same reason, and let them know my wife would be the only one to hear from me. I worried over which books to take with me, fearing incremation should they be discovered in my backpack by a curious border guard. Solheim was too critical of communism to consider. A fine balance was too critical of enforced states of emergency, and Rushdie was too critical in general. I even crossed Somerset Morgan's off-humane bondage off the list. As a final precaution, my wife and I nominated a danger word. I promised to call her every day if I could, and we decided that if ever anything were to go wrong and I needed to discreetly let her know, either by telephone, email or letter, I would insert this word. She promised to stay optimistic while I was away, but her final words to me when I left the house that morning were, "Just be careful, please." My wife was right to be worried, and I knew that far better than I ever allowed her to believe. Arrests, interrogations, torture and executions have occurred in Tibet and in China, with an unremitting consistence over the last 60 years.
So a really lovely practice.
They are not of the overt kind, but are instead
it's called the gratitude tree,
clandestine
and I'm sure
and largely hidden from the general knowledge. For many in Tibet, the 21st century standard of life remains as dangerous and as compromised as it was during the Cultural Revolution. 3,000 Tibetans a year continue to flee from Tibet and seek refugee status in India, and a large number of the country's spiritual leaders have either joined them or simply disappeared. For those monks and members of the laity who choose to stay, many continue to be imprisoned for offences and innocuous as flying as a Tibetan flag or calling Bovang Zen, Free Tibet, in the streets.
So it's really...
And once incarcerated, they are often tortured in manners which contravene the Convention Against Torture, ratified by China itself in 1988, including beatings with electric batons, submerging into sewage pits, being hanged upside down for inordinate lengths of time, and harassment by dogs. Death in such treatment is not uncommon, though it is the truth that only a handful of these instances have involved foreigners. Many of those foreigners, the targets, if you like, have been writers, reporters or broadcasters. Those with the means to reveal, over the past 11 years, China as a whole has held the title for imprisoning the most journalists, surpassing Myanmar, Iran and Cuba. One filmmaker was arrested and detained after filming everyday scenes of Tibetan life within the autonomous region. Another had to endure the brutality of the Chinese Lhasa police before being deported for inadvertently catching a demonstration on camera. In 1999, an Australian and an American, both freelance researchers, were arrested and interrogated by the Public Security Bureau in Tibet, Amdo. The American was found some days later in a hospital with serious injuries to his spine, liver and wheals. His official paperwork claimed that he had incurred the injuries after jumping from a third-story window of the hotel in which he was detained in an attempt to escape.
Thank you so much for
Few believe this version of events. He was almost certainly pushed. The examples go as far back as 1950, the year of Tibet's liberation by China, when Robert Ford, an English radio operator who had worked for the independent Tibetan government for over a year, was captured by the invading Chinese army. Considered a spy, Ford was jailed for 5 years, enduring in that time countless interrogations, programs of re-education, and the constant threat of education. Clearly, the Chinese had no qualms about arresting Englishmen over the issue of words, and I knew then that all the conversations I was to have, all the notes I was to take, would have to be quiet and encoded. As the plane left Heathrow's runway, and the English soil with it, and as the flight map on the screen embedded in the headrest of the before me revealed a straight dotted line,
I hope this isn't backwards.
so unlike the one from 7 years in Tibet,
It's beginnings.
which marked out our journey around the globe from London to Beijing.
And
I took out my Tibet guidebook
which came up
and I
twice,
thumbed
actually.
through its
Kind of
pages,
discounted it first.
stopping at a subheading entitled
And then said, no,
The Friendship Highway.
it's cherished.
This was Tibet's main road, also
It's
known
actually
as the China-Nepal
fits in really
Highway,
beautifully with
which crossed the
the
440
arms,
miles from the
lover,
Tibetan
breather.
capital,
to
Lhasa,
remember to cherish
all the way
yourself
down to Zangmu,
with every
the
breath.
border town across the river from Nepal.
And
It was at the end of the Friendship Highway, in the deep south of Tibet, at Zangmu itself, that I was to meet Lobsang, a man who, at the age of 5, had fled with his family on the 11th of March 1989, after his brother Shoigel had become involved in the notorious Lhasa uprisings of that year. A man who, at the age of 5, had crossed the Himalayas on foot and on his father's back. A man who, at the age of 5, had witnessed the execution of his brother Dorji.
really lovely, just take all the time. How do you feel?
Who had come to smuggle them into Nepal by Chinese border guards, a man who over the next 20 years had lived a life more terrifying
thank you all
and
of
more
you for
hopeful and
joining us this
startling
evening
and courageous and enlivening
for
than
it
any
brought me
man
a
I
sense
had ever
of
known.
connection
On that plane, I had
and
no
a
idea
sense
where my
of
own journey was to take me,
purpose.
nor to whom. I thought only about whether or not
would do this
I would
thing
get
to
into Tibet.
Just to share these moments, to bring this energy through and
Hawaii.
to be fully present.
There was
So
a
it's really
wide
helped
and
me to be
tumultuous river.
with you and with myself
There was a sloppy and burning meal which made
So
Lobsang
thank
feel
you
like
all
his
of you for
mother was
coming.
bleeding.
on this
There was a
call
dark
tonight, on this
man who
journey.
looked at Jamyang in a way Lobsang did not like, and another who pushed his father in a way which
And
Lobsang
the
liked
beauty
even
of having
less.
this time
There was a road
together
so smooth
over
it
the
could be
next,
slept upon.
5 more
There
sessions
was a
after
fat
this
and
one.
hairless yak,
Um,
and there was no
is,
Dorji.
you know,
For
we
all
know
these reasons,
most of
Lobsang
you,
did
I
not
think
like
maybe all of
Nepal.
you, here, and some of you will know
He
each
mentioned
other.
this in his confidence to
But there's always
Choipol,
the beginning.
his
kind
voice
of
low
really,
so that his mother would not hear him.
Kind of they come
She had not
together.
spoken since the
I always
mountain,
think of it as a
had
constellation.
barely been able to
So it's
walk,
like the constellation
and
coming
it was
together.
Lobsang who woke
So
her
it's like
knees.
that when you first meet
He did not
someone.
mind the role's
there's always a
reversal,
bit, it can feel
for
a
it was
bit
only
kind
during
of
the first few
getting to know
seconds
each
of her
other,
eyes
or
opening
getting to know the energy
when she
or
would reach
something
out to stroke his
in the
forehead.
first interaction.
That he saw
And
her
then as
smile
we go
anymore.
on, the practices will
But then her fingers would abruptly
deepen
stop their
and
tracing
more be
above his
added
eyes,
in, and
his lips
there'll
would
be
droop, and he would
deeper,
not
more
see her smile
expansive,
again for another 24 hours.
I want
I
to
want
say
to go
remembering
home,
actually rather than
he whispered to
understanding,
Toigul.
remembering of what
So do I,
this
Toigul
is,
whispered back.
and how we can just
Lobsang
be
liked
with
it when
each
his
other.
brother whispered to him.
Um,
There was a loud
though we're
vehicle
not in the
with
same
3
room.
wheels.
It's quite extraordinary how
There was a naked old man, down from
connected
head to
we
toe in
can
grey
feel
ash,
over
grey
the
ash
internet,
whose
especially
eyes
when we
Lobsang
keep
could not
meeting
meet.
like this.
There was rain, so fat and heavy that Lobsang could
Was there
barely
a
breathe,
point
let
to what I
alone
was saying
stand.
then?
Everything was upside down, while Lobsang's mother
Oh
grew even
dear.
more distant, and Choigul grew even more compassionate towards his little
Yeah.
brother.
Yeah.
Yamian
No idea
threw
why I
her
was going
jade
with that.
amulet into the river,
Um,
and Lobsang's father, once so
Well,
quiet,
Dad, is
started
please
to
do
articulate
take
everything.
this.
Sorry, can I just do it? Yeah.
Each minute
So
of the
what I wanted
journey
to say in
south was
that-
filled with his manly descriptions of the
Sometimes I
stones
get
beneath.
so kind of on what I'm saying, I forget what I'm saying.
Each minute of the journey south was filled with his rambling descriptions of the stones beneath their feet and the sky above their heads, as if words had become his rosary beads to click through and mark off his place in the world and his path through it. And Lobsang stopped sleeping. What was the point? Without Dorji, why would he want to make the time pass any quicker? There was a language he could not understand, yet everybody around him could. There was something in his clothes, something which bit and drew forth soaring red welts, which he scratched at in a maddening escalation of pleasure and pain. There was a nighttime fire on a roadside which burnt not from dung, but from wood, and which smelled delicious. There was heat throughout that night like he had never known, so intense he stripped off his clothes and lay naked beneath the stars. The tang of his own sweat, both reassuring and unfamiliar. And there was the journey. Such a long journey. Lobsang missed the Tibetan truck where his family had made a little rest, and where he had made a little den within that little nest. A den which stretched from the folds of his mother's skirts to the fraying lip of plastic sheeting, which flipped down from the wobbling crates wedged against the wall, taller than him, twice overhead. Lobsang had felt safe then, but he did not hear in Nepal. He confessed this to Choigal once as they sat on the edge of the road while their father begged passers-by for help on their journey south. Choigal did not reply this time, but he picked Lobsang up and took him to see some chickens. They returned to find that the father had been successful. A wonderful family, he explained, in 1,000 words, too many, had shown them compassion and paid for them all to ride a bus to Kathmandu that afternoon. Lobsang met the family and agreed to dance for them in exchange for the soft and greasy sheets of folded white tamsa, which they pressed into his hands, and which he ate so many of that he had to run back to the safety of his chickens to be sick in private. When he returned, sheepish and quiet, it was not his mother who wiped his mouth clean, but Choigal. When the bus arrived, Lobsang decided that he was in love with it, painted in a rainbow of haphazard and meandering colours. It shuddered and farted with such regularity that Lobsang laughed so hard he thought he might have to run off to the chickens to be sick again. Noting the two people sat cross-legged on the roof, Lobsang insisted that he was going to sit with them all the way to Kathmandu, 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 Udnantat, 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 Udnatkat, Udnatkat, Udnattak, 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 Kathmandu. Nothing the two people sat cross-legged on the roof. Lobsang insisted that he was going to sit with them all the way to Kathmandu. Choigal took his arm and pulled him up the steps and inside to sit on a hard seat, where Lobsang decided he would have to cry if he was going to get his own way. But then the bus farted again, and he was too convulsed with giggles to protest. As the bus set off and careered along the road, Lobsang climbed over his brother and swayed down this aisle towards his mother, who had chosen a seat away from the rest of the family and had already fallen asleep. Climbing onto her lap, he wedged his head between her breasts and thought about Dorji until he too drifted off. A shrill sound woke him, the sound of a mastiff at night, and Lobsang leapt to his feet, his face plunging into the bare belly of a middle-aged Nepali lady. She shrieked at him, and in a panic he whirled about and became lost in the folds of her sari. His mother swept him into her arms, and his anxiety peaked, carried him out of the bus, and then passed him to Choigal, who gently placed him on his feet beside a huge and shitting cow. Lobsang gazed at the Kathmandu around him, and his family began to dizzily walk through it. The horn-happy taxis and the veering rickshaws, the thin windy streets which splayed out in every direction, the bars and markets, travel agencies, the people so pale they were surely ghosts from those days. His father talked about after he drank too much chang, the hawkers who grappled Choigal and Jang Mung by the arms and whispered short but strange words Lobsang could not understand. The flashing pink neon lights above the shop doorways, which he would later learn advertised massage parlours and novelty boutiques, and which promoted the sale of toys, lotions, lubricants,